Welcome to the Crime Stories channel, where we uncover the darkest true tales of crime, mystery, and justice. From chilling cases to shocking twists, each story takes you deep into the shadows of the human mind. Settle in. The story's about to begin. Empire of Shadows. The Five Families of New York Part 1. Foundations 1900 to 1930 Chapter 1. The arrival of the winter of 1903 bit into New York with a merciless edge. Snow swirled through the narrow streets of lower Manhattan, coating cobblestones in a slick, treacherous glaze. Smoke from the tenement chimneys curled into the gray sky like ghostly fingers, carrying the scent of salted pork, burning coal, and the faint, lingering hope of the immigrant. Ellis Island bristled with anxious energy. Families disembarked from ships that had crossed the Atlantic. Clutching small suitcases and worn satchels, their eyes wide with expectation and fear. Among them, 5 young men would unknowingly shape the city's destiny for decades. Vincenzo Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Carmine Lucchese, Giuseppe Bonanno, and Carmine Colombo. Vincenzo Genovese stepped onto the crowded docks with a watchful gaze. His village in Sicily had been swallowed by poverty and violence, leaving him with nothing but a worn Bible and the steel in his spine. Every step through the bustling crowds was careful. Measured, he could feel the pulse of the city, the opportunity and the danger intertwined in every street corner. Across the harbor, Carlo Gambino's broad shoulders pushed through a throng of porters. He laughed easily, his voice carrying above the clamor. But his eyes scanned constantly, reading the angles of potential allies and rivals alike. Carlo had learned early that survival required more than brute strength. It demanded the ability to command respect and strike decisively when needed. Queens was quieter, industrial, yet restless. Carmine Lucchese arrived with his family, silent, observant, cataloging every interaction, every merchant, every union man. Patience and foresight were his tools. While others relied on fists or bullets, Carmine would build his empire through influence, subtlety, and control. In the Bronx, Giuseppe Bonanno carried the confidence of youth, charm as natural as his Sicilian accent. But his temper was quick, his instincts sharp. The streets were a proving ground, and he intended to leave a mark, both feared and respected. Finally, in Brooklyn, Carmine Colombo stepped off the ferry into a city of chaos and possibility. Small in stature, but quick of mind and reflex. He understood that opportunity could appear anywhere and that survival demanded both speed and cunning. The streets of New York were alive with chaos. Carts rattling over cobblestones, factory whistles signaling shifts, immigrants jostling through crowded sidewalks, and the faint echo of church bells. But beneath the surface, another rhythm pulsed: crime, loyalty, fear, and ambition. The 5 young men, each in his own way, walked the same streets, unaware of the others, yet each beginning to etch the foundation of empires that would one day dominate the city. In dimly lit rooms above bakeries, warehouses, and small shops, deals were whispered, alliances formed, and rivalries began to simmer. For Vincenzo's survival meant control of the waterfronts. For Carlo, it meant building power through muscle and respect. For Carmine Lucchese, it meant weaving a network invisible to most. For Joe Bonanno, it was a mixture of charm and ruthless unpredictability. For Carmine Colombo, it was opportunity exploited with precision. The city was a crucible. Here the weak were consumed, the cunning thrived, and the ruthless endured. Each young man was a seed, and the harsh streets of New York would determine which would grow into oaks and which would wither under the weight of ambition. By nightfall, the city glimmered with gas lamps and faint neon signs. The immigrants' dreams and fears mingled with the smoke of chimneys and the cries of street vendors. Somewhere, deals were struck that would one day ripple through Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. And somewhere the first whispers began: "The 5 families are coming. Respect them, or die." Chapter 2. The rise of the bosses 1910 to 1930, the streets of New York had grown restless. Tenements swelled with families, factories belched smoke day and night, and the city's pulse quickened with commerce and ambition. In the neighborhoods of Little Italy, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and beyond, a new kind of power was quietly emerging. Vincenzo Genovese, now known simply as Vito, moved with a deliberate grace along the Manhattan docks. The waterfront was a labyrinth of warehouses, shipping crates, and laborers, and control here meant influence over commerce itself. He had learned that brute force alone could not secure power. It required intelligence, subtlety, and alliances. In a dim room above a bakery on Mulberry Street, Vito met with Marco the Shadow Rinaldi, his trusted consigliere. Maps of docks and warehouses lay spread across the table. "They're moving shipments without our permission," Marco said, pointing to a cluster of markings. "The Colombo boys?" Vito shook his head. "It doesn't matter who. Territory is a language. Actions speak louder than words. Let them test us. Every move they make, we anticipate." Nearby in Brooklyn, Carlo Gambino's approach contrasted sharply. Where Vito worked in shadows, Carlo asserted himself physically, a constant, looming presence. At a Red Hook pier, he met with his lieutenants. The docks rattled under the weight of arriving ships, the smell of salt water and coal heavy in the air. "East Side boys tried to muscle in last night," Carlo said, his voice calm but sharp. "They'll pay. No mercy, no hesitation. Make it clean." His men nodded, knowing the code. Obedience was survival. Hesitation was death. Gambino's genius was timing. He struck decisively, overwhelming rivals with force, yet calculated enough to leave no trace of recklessness. Brooklyn learned quickly that defiance was not an option. Queens presented a different challenge. Carmine Lucchese observed quietly, cataloging every movement in the garment districts and trucking companies. He had discovered that influence could be exerted without a single gunshot. Union leaders, small business owners, and politicians were manipulated with carefully placed favors, bribes, and threats. In a Flushing warehouse, Lucchese met with a union captain. "Yesterday's strike cost your employer thousands," he said smoothly. "Imagine the profits if we worked together instead of against each other." The union man hesitated. "And what do we get?" Lucchese's lips curved in a subtle smile. "Protection, influence, profit. And if anyone crosses us, consequences." In the Bronx, Joe Bonanno's rise relied on unpredictability. Charm and violence coexisted in him, making his name feared and respected. A rival gang attempting to infiltrate his gambling dens discovered the duality of Bonanno's rule: charm when convenient, fury when necessary. Those who survived left bruised but wiser, and those who betrayed him disappeared. Brooklyn's Carmine Colombo preferred opportunism over confrontation. When rival crews clashed over bootlegging routes, he waited, studied, and then struck at the precise moment. Both sides were exhausted, both were vulnerable. Colombo's men moved swiftly, claiming the spoils and loyalty of impressed onlookers. Chaos became his ally, and timing became his weapon. By the mid-1920s, the five families had begun to form an unspoken hierarchy. Manhattan bowed to Vito's precision. Brooklyn respected Carlo's muscle. Queens feared Lucchese's invisible hand. The Bronx endured Bonanno's unpredictability, and Colombo capitalized on opportunity wherever it appeared. Yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. Small betrayals, minor hijackings, and subtle incursions tested the delicate balance. A dockworker loyal to Genovese accepted a bribe from a rival. A Lucchese accountant skimmed a shipment's value for himself. In each instance, punishment was swift and decisive, warning that loyalty was mandatory, betrayal intolerable. Prohibition intensified these conflicts. Legal liquor, gambling, and extortion created both opportunities and hazards. Every shipment, every speakeasy, every backroom deal became a battlefield. Blood had been spilled, reputations forged, and empires quietly consolidated. By 1930, the city's underworld was no longer a scattered collection of small gangs. It had begun to coalesce into 5 distinct empires, each shaped by the personality, strategy, and temperament of its leader. The 5 families were rising, and the streets of New York had begun to whisper their names with both fear and respect. Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Carmine Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, and Carmine Colombo had arrived not just as men, but as the architects of a hidden kingdom, one built on loyalty, fear, cunning, and blood. And somewhere, in the shadows, the first hints of war were already stirring. Chapter 3. Blood in the Streets, 1920 to 1930, the Volstead Act fell like a hammer. And with it came rivers of opportunity. Prohibition turned New York into a city of thirst. and the thirsty paid well. Speakeasies sprouted like weeds, liquor flowed in hidden streams, and for those ruthless enough to control it. The law itself became the greatest business partner of all. For the five families, it was a crucible. Power was no longer an ambition, it was necessity. The first blood on a rain-slick night in 1922, a shipment bound for a Gambino-controlled dock vanished. Barrels of Canadian whiskey worth a fortune disappeared into the fog. Carlo Gambino stood in the warehouse, fists clenched as his men whispered names. Genovese, one muttered. Maybe his boys rerouted it. Carlo's eyes narrowed. He said nothing at first, just let the silence grow heavy, suffocating. Finally, his voice cut through like steel. Find them. Bring me the truth. If it's his, we send a message. It wasn't Genovese. The culprits were small-time thieves from the Bronx acting without permission. When Gambino's men dragged them back, beaten and bloodied, Carlo made an example. The warehouse echoed with their screams, then silence. By dawn, their bodies floated in the East River. The message was clear. Brooklyn was Gambino territory. Interference meant death. Genovese's counter across the river, Vito Genovese, heard of the incident and smiled faintly, not because he envied Carlo's brutality, but because he saw the weakness behind it. Violence drew attention. Violence attracted the police. Genovese preferred shadows. At a smoky cafe on Mulberry Street, Genovese leaned toward his consigliere. Carlo's strength is his temper, he said quietly, but strength without patience becomes weakness. Let him bleed for his reputation. We'll profit in silence. And so Genovese infiltrated. Bribes to dock officials, quiet deals with union bosses, discreet partnerships with politicians. While Gambino spilled blood, Genovese expanded invisibly, like ink soaking into paper. Cusi strike Carmine Lucchese watched both with measured detachment. Queens was fertile ground, the garment factories and trucking firms providing endless points of leverage. He saw opportunity not in bullets but in contracts. A rival union leader refused Lucchese's offer one morning. By afternoon, the man's trucks had vanished, his workers had walked out, and his creditors circled like vultures. Days later, desperate and broken, the man came crawling to Lucchese's door. "You'll have your cut," he whispered. Lucchese didn't raise his voice, simply nodded, as though the outcome had been inevitable. In truth, it had. Bonanno's fury, Joe Bonanno, was different. In the Bronx, his empire grew from gambling dens and speakeasies, and his reputation from sudden bursts of violence. When a rival crew torched one of his speakeasies, Joe didn't convene councils or plot subtle revenge. He stormed their hideout with his men, Tommy guns blazing. The walls shook with gunfire, and by the time the smoke cleared, the rival crew no longer existed. Bonanno's men loved him for it. His enemies feared him for it. And New York began to understand that the Bronx was not a place for quiet disputes. It was a place for blood. Colombo's opportunism, meanwhile, Carmine Colombo thrived on chaos. He didn't need to start wars. He simply waited for others to stumble. During a turf skirmish between Gambino and Bonanno men in Brooklyn, Colombo's crew quietly swept in, taking control of an abandoned warehouse and its shipments. By the time the shooting stopped, Colombo had doubled his profits. "Let them kill each other," he told his captains with a sly grin. "We'll be the ones left counting the money." The first council by 1928, blood had stained too many streets. The police grew restless, newspapers screamed of gang wars, and politicians demanded order. The bosses themselves began to see the truth. Endless war meant endless weakness. So, in a dimly lit room above a restaurant in Little Italy, the five men gathered for the first time. The table was long, the wine flowing, the tension thick. Vito Genovese broke the silence first. "We bleed too much for too little. The city is vast enough for us all, but boundaries must be respected." Carlo Gambino leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Respect is earned, not begged for. If anyone crosses into Brooklyn again, there will be no council-only funerals." Bonanno slammed his fist against the table, wine spilling. "Let them try. Burn their houses down." Lucchese raised a hand, calm and calculating. "There is profit in peace. Profit we all share." "What is one shipment compared to decades of power?" Colombo smirked. "While you argue, I'm already making money." The room erupted in laughter, though beneath it, suspicion lingered. Agreements were made, lines drawn, alliances tested. But everyone knew the truth. Peace was temporary. Blood was inevitable. By 1930, the five families stood tall. Their empires were young, but their roots were deep. It tasted blood, betrayal, and profit. And each understood that survival required more than violence. It required cunning, timing, and the ability to strike when least expected. And so the city waited, restless, knowing that in the shadows of its alleys and tenements, five kings were carving a kingdom out of fear, loyalty, and ambition. The wars had begun. Part 2, Empires and Shadows. Chapter 4, Genovese's Empire, 1930 to 1945. Manhattan pulsed with light, commerce, and ambition. Skyscrapers clawed at the sky, Wall Street thrived, and the nightclubs of Harlem buzzed with jazz and liquor. But beneath the glow in the quiet alleys and smoke-filled cafes, another empire stretched its roots, an empire ruled by Vito Genovese. Where others ruled with fists or fury, Vito ruled with patience. He understood that Manhattan was not a battlefield to be conquered with bullets, but a kingdom to be inherited through silence, influence, and control. His men called him Il Fantasmath, the ghost, because his power was felt everywhere, but his presence rarely seen. The art of shadows. In a cafe on Mulberry Street, Vito sat in a corner booth, a glass of red wine untouched before him. His consigliere, Marco Rinaldi, slid a ledger across the table. Shipments came through last night. Dock bosses have been paid. But Marco hesitated, glancing around. A Lucchese man has been asking questions in Hell's Kitchen. Vito's dark eyes narrowed, his voice quiet but sharp. Questions lead to answers. Answers lead to weakness. Silence him, but gently. We don't need blood, not yet. The next day, the Lucchese man disappeared. A body was found, no shots fired. He simply ceased to exist, his name erased from the streets, as if he had never been there. This was Genovese's wave. Violence without spectacle, death without trace. The politicians smile. Genovese's true strength lay in his ability to infiltrate. While Gambino crushed rivals and Bonanno terrorized the Bronx, Vito slipped into the veins of the city itself. A handshake with a judge over dinner, an envelope passed to a police captain, a quiet meeting with a city councilman in a dimly lit apartment. Each deal, each favor, bound Manhattan tighter into his grasp. You see, Marco, Vito said one evening, strolling along the Hudson, the skyline glowing above them. A bullet kills a man, but a bribe owns him, which is worth more in the long run. Marco chuckled. You never miss a chance to buy silence. Vito's smile was cold. Silence is priceless. A betrayal in blood, but shadows, for all their power, cannot prevent betrayal. In 1935, one of Vito's trusted captains, Salvatore De Luca, skimmed money from a liquor operation in Midtown. The theft was discovered not by accountants, but by whispers in Harlem, carried to Vito by loyal ears. For days, Vito said nothing. Salvatore continued his rounds, unaware that judgment had already been passed. Finally, Vito summoned him to the back room of a cigar shop. Candles flickered against brick walls, casting long shadows. You disappoint me, Salvatore, Vito said softly, almost kindly. De Luca's face paled. It was a mistake, boss. The shot came before he could finish. Quick, silent, final. His body was removed before dawn, dumped in the river. By sunrise, the city never spoke his name again. Vito poured himself a glass of wine that evening, savoring the quiet. Betrayal, he whispered to Marco, is cancer. Cut it early, and the body survives. The war that wasn't, in 1937, tensions nearly erupted into war. Bonanno's men clashed with Gambino's on the east side, leaving 3 bodies in an alley. Rumors spread that Genovese had backed the Bonannos, fanning the flames. Carlo Gambino demanded a council. At the meeting held in the back of an uptown restaurant, tempers flared. Bonanno slammed his fist against the table, accusing Gambino of encroachment. Gambino growled threats, his men bristling at his back. Genovese sat silently through it all, sipping his wine, watching. Finally, when silence fell, he spoke. Gentlemen, war fills graves, not coffers. While you waste men on streets, I buy judges. While you bleed, I profit. If you wish to kill each other, fine. But remember, when the dust settles, Manhattan will still belong to me." The room fell quiet. Even Bonanno, fiery as he was, lowered his gaze. There was no war. Not then. The Ghost King. By 1945, Genovese's empire stretched across Manhattan. He controlled docks, unions, and judges, his influence woven into the very structure of the city. While other families thrived on visible displays of power, Vito thrived on absence. He left no fingerprints, no evidence, no trail of blood in the streets, yet everyone knew Manhattan belonged to him. From the jazz clubs of Harlem to the courthouses downtown, whispers of his name carried weight. He was unseen but undeniable. And the other families, though they ruled their boroughs with strength, unpredictability, or cunning, understood one truth. Vito Genovese was the Ghost King of Manhattan, and ghosts were hardest to kill. Chapter Wu, Gambino's Muscle, Ijo Senling Dao Ijo Siwu. Brooklyn was a kingdom built on sweat and fire. Its docks roared with the clang of steel, its warehouses hummed with smuggled goods, and its tenements overflowed with restless men who had fled hunger in Sicily, Calabria, and Naples. It was here, among the grit and smoke, that Carlo Gambino built his empire, not with whispers, like Genovese, but with fists, knives, and gun barrels. The dock wars. The docks were lifeblood. Ships from Havana, Halifax, and Europe carried liquor, arms, and contraband. Whoever controlled the docks controlled the arteries of New York's underworld. Carlo stood on Pier 17 one misty dawn, his sharp suit a contrast to the grime around him. His men formed a half-circle behind him, watching as a rival crew unloaded crates marked with false Cuban seals. Carlo's voice was calm, almost gentle. "This is my pier. You don't belong here." The rival boss, Tony D'Amato, smirked. "Brooklyn is big enough for both of us." Carlo gave a small nod. His men moved like wolves. The sound of fists and knives echoed across the fog, followed by the thunder of a pistol. When it was over, the crates were Gambino's and Tony's body floated in the bay. By the end of that year, the docks bent to Carlo's will. Captains, longshoremen, and foremen took his money or his bullets. Either way, the flow of goods belonged to him. Fear is currency. Unlike Genovese, Carlo didn't buy silence with bribes alone. He believed in fear, clean, sharp, unforgettable fear. A truck driver once failed to deliver a shipment on time, skimming bottles for himself. Carlo had the man tied to a chair in an abandoned warehouse, the missing whiskey lined neatly at his feet. "You think this is a game?" Carlo asked, his Sicilian accent thick, his eyes flat as stone. The man begged, sobbing, promising to repay. Carlo leaned down, whispering as though sharing a secret. "If I forgive you, others will steal. If I punish you, others will obey." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The sound of the man's screams carried into the night, a warning no one forgot. Alliances and blood. Carlo was no fool. Fear could control men, but alliances controlled cities. He began weaving pacts with other borough bosses, offering muscle in exchange for respect. When Bonanno fought a Harlem gang encroaching on the Bronx, Carlo sent soldiers armed with Tommy guns. The battle was short, brutal, decisive. Afterward, Joe Bonanno clasped Carlo's hand. "You're a man I can trust," he said. Carlo smiled faintly. "Trust is built with blood, my friend. I've spilled enough to earn it." These alliances gave Carlo weight at the council table. He was not merely Brooklyn's king, he was a kingmaker, the Feast of Knives. But alliances had limits. In 1938, Colombo's men tried to seize a warehouse near Red Hook, claiming it was abandoned territory. Carlo responded not with negotiation, but with slaughter. On a hot August night, his soldiers stormed the warehouse. Blades flashed, gunfire cracked, and by dawn, Colombo's men lay in heaps among the crates. Carlo walked through the carnage, the smell of blood thick in the air. He lit a cigarette, his face unreadable. "Send word to Carmine," he told his men. "Brooklyn is mine. He touches it again, I'll send him back his captains in pieces." Colombo never tested him again. The loyal beast. Despite his cruelty, Carlo inspired loyalty. He shared his wealth with his soldiers, attended their weddings, and paid for funerals when police bullets struck them down. To his men, he was not merely a boss, he was a protector. At his nephew's christening, Carlo stood as godfather, a rare smile on his face. His soldiers filled the pews, their families crowding the church, all under his gaze. "Family is everything," Carlo whispered to the child in his arms. "Blood protects blood, always." It was not sentiment, it was strategy. By binding himself to his men through family and ritual, he ensured obedience that no bribe or threat alone could secure. The shadow of war. By 1945, Carlo Gambino's empire stretched across Brooklyn and Staten Island. He owned the docks, controlled the unions, and commanded an army of loyal soldiers. Where Genovese was a ghost, Carlo was a beast of muscle and steel. The newspapers spoke of gang wars, of blood in alleys and bodies in rivers. But within the five families, one truth became clear. Carlo Gambino was the hammer. When alliances faltered, when rivals grew bold, when fear alone was not enough, Carlo's muscle restored order. And though his methods were brutal, his rule was undeniable. Brooklyn was his kingdom, and his name carried weight from the docks to the darkest tenements. The beast of Brooklyn had risen, and he was far from finished. Chapter 6. Lucchese's web, 1930 to 1945 Queens, was not as loud as Brooklyn, not as dazzling as Manhattan, not as wild as the Bronx. It was a place of factories, warehouses, and quiet streets lined with immigrant families who worked long hours and asked few questions. For Carmine Lucchese, this was fertile ground not for bullets, but for contracts, not for blood, but for threads of influence woven so tightly that escape was impossible. Lucchese never shouted. He rarely drew a gun. He smiled, shook hands, and signed papers. Yet with each handshake, with each signature, another strand of his web tightened around the city. The Union Gambit. It began with the garment district. Thousands of workers, mostly Italian and Jewish immigrants, labored in sweatshops for pennies. The unions, meant to protect them, were fractured and corrupt. Lucchese saw not chaos, but opportunity. At a smoky meeting in a union hall, Carmine addressed the weary men. "You deserve fair wages," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You deserve dignity. I can give you that if you give me your loyalty." The men, tired of broken promises, agreed. Within weeks, strikes began. Factories halted. Owners panicked. And when Lucchese walked into their offices, his demands were simple: contracts for his trucking companies, kickbacks to his organization, and silence. The owners signed. They always signed. The spider at the center. Lucchese's genius was patience. He didn't need to own the docks like Gambino or bribe judges like Genovese. He needed only to sit in the center of his web, waiting for others to fall into it. A factory owner who refused his terms found his workers on strike. His deliveries vanished, his creditors at the door. Days later, broken and desperate, the owner would crawl to Lucchese begging for relief. Carmine would smile, pour him a glass of wine, and say, "Of course, I only want to help." Help came with chains, and soon the owner was his, another fly caught in the web. A deal with Genovese in 1934, Lucchese and Vito Genovese met in a dim back room above a cigar shop. The air was thick with smoke, their lieutenant standing guard outside. "You control the docks," Lucchese said evenly, "but without trucks, goods don't move." "I control the trucks." Genovese's dark eyes narrowed. "And you want a partnership? You move it to shore? I move it inland. We share the profits." There was silence. Then, slowly, Genovese smiled. "You weave your web well, Carmine." The deal was struck, and with it, Lucchese tied his web into Genovese's empire. Together, they became untouchable, one handling the sea, the other the land. The quiet knife, though patient, Lucchese was not gentle. When betrayal came, he responded with surgical precision. In 1937, a trusted lieutenant, Angelo Russo, began skimming money from union dues. Carmine invited him to dinner at a modest Queens trattoria. The table was set with pasta and wine, laughter filling the air. Midway through the meal, Carmine leaned forward. "Angelo, you've disappointed me." The room grew still. Angelo stammered excuses, his face pale. Lucchese's smile never faded. "A web cannot survive with broken strands." A nod to his men, a flash of steel, and Angelo slumped forward into his plate. The dinner continued without pause, the waiters instructed to clean up quietly. By dessert, Angelo's chair was empty, and no one dared mention his name again. The network expands. By the 1940s, Lucchese's influence stretched across Queens and into Manhattan. He controlled the garment industry, trucking firms, and even construction companies. Judges and inspectors looked the other way. Politicians smiled when he entered a room. Unlike Gambino's violence or Bonanno's fury, Lucchese's power was invisible but suffocating. A man might wake one morning believing himself free, only to find every path, every delivery, every contract, every loan entangled in Lucchese's threads. The web completed by 1945, Carmine Lucchese's empire was secure. He did not roar like Gambino or whisper like Genovese. He simply waited, patient and smiling, as the city came to him. Queens was his domain, but his reach extended far beyond. He was not the strongest, nor the most feared, but he was the most inevitable. For in New York, bullets could kill a man. But only a web silent, unseen, unbreakable, could hold an empire. And Carmine Lucchese was the spider at its center. Chapter 7. Bonanno's Shadows, 1930 to 1945. The Bronx was restless. Tenements stacked upon tenements, streets humming with laborers and gamblers, these thick with the smell of sweat and smoke. It was not refined like Manhattan or controlled like Brooklyn. It was volatile, untamed. And in that chaos thrived Joseph Bonanno. Where Genovese was the ghost and Gambino the beast, Bonanno was fire-sudden, consuming, unpredictable. His men never knew if he would embrace them with a smile or unleash fury with a bullet. Two enemies, he was a storm that came without warning. The Speakeasy Inferno in 1931. Rival crews tried to muscle into one of Bonanno's largest speakeasies near Arthur Avenue. They demanded a cut, sneering at Joe's youth and dismissing his claim to the Bronx. Joe answered not with words, but with flames. One midnight, his men doused the rival speakeasy with kerosene and set it alight. The building burned bright against the night, liquor exploding in bursts, screams echoing through the street. The next morning, Joe walked calmly through the ashes, his suit spotless, his fedora tilted low. "Let this be my signature," he told his captains. "No one touches what is mine." The message seared itself into the Bronx. Bonanno was not to be tested. A boss among soldiers, Bonanno's strength lay not only in violence, but in loyalty. He lived among his men, drank with them, celebrated their weddings, stood godfather to their children. At one gathering, a soldier raised his glass. To Joe, a boss who bleeds with his family, Joe smiled, clinking his glass. "I bleed for loyalty. Betray me, and I'll bleed you dry." The men roared with laughter, but they knew his words were not a jest. The betrayal of Rocco. In 1936, betrayal struck. Rocco Marino, a longtime lieutenant, began passing information to Gambino's crew, hoping for a larger cut of the dock shipments. When word reached Joe, his temper ignited. He summoned Rocco to a warehouse on Bruckner Boulevard. The room was silent, shadows long in the flickering light. Joe paced slowly, his voice calm but trembling with rage. "You eat at my table, Rocco? You take my money. And still you sell me." Rocco stammered, begging forgiveness. Joe drew his pistol. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Rocco's body crumpled, badly beaten, laying across the concrete. Joe stood over him, chest heaving, then turned to his men. "Loyalty is life. Betrayal is death. Remember this." The lesson echoed through the Bronx for years. The council clashed. Bonanno's fire often clashed with Genovese's patience and Gambino's control. At a council in 1939, disputes erupted over territories in Harlem. Genovese argued for restraint. Gambino demanded boundaries. Lucchese urged compromise. Bonanno slammed his fist on the table, eyes blazing. Boundaries? Compromise. The Bronx is mine, and anyone who touches it burns. His words silenced the room. Even Gambino, whose temper matched his, leaned back smirking. "Careful, Joe," Carlo muttered. "Fires burn out of control." Joe's eyes narrowed. Better to burn than to rot. The tension lingered, but no war erupted. Not yet. The Bronx throne. By 1945, Joe Bonanno's rule was absolute in the Bronx. Gambling dens, speakeasies, loan sharking operations all bent to his will. His reputation as both protector and punisher made him untouchable. Children whispered his name with awe, wives cursed it in fear, and soldiers wore it like a shield. Behind the fire there was cunning. Joe knew that unpredictability was his greatest weapon. No rival could anticipate him. No ally could fully trust him. The Bronx was his kingdom, and he ruled it not with shadows or web spet, with fire. And though fire consumes, it also purifies. To Bonanno, it was not destruction. It was survival. Chapter 8. Colombo Intrigue, 1930 to 1945. Carmine Colombo was not the strongest, nor the richest, nor the most feared. But he was the most patient snake in the grass. Where Gambino fought with fists, Genovese with shadows, Lucchese with webs, and Bonanno with fire, Colombo thrived in the spaces between. He was the jackal among lions, waiting for others to clash, then feasting on the remains. The opportunist in 1932, Gambino's men battled Bonanno's crew in Brooklyn, leaving warehouses abandoned and bodies scattered. While the newspapers screamed of bloodshed, Colombo quietly moved in. His men swept through the ruins, taking control of liquor shipments, gambling halls, and dock connections that neither Gambino nor Bonanno could focus on while nursing their wounds. "War is waste," Colombo told his captains one evening in a dim Brooklyn tavern, "but waste leaves scraps. Scraps feed us well." The men laughed, pockets heavy with newfound profit. The mask of respectability, Colombo understood appearances. He dressed not in flashy suits like Bonanno, nor in austere black like Genovese, but in modest, respectable clothing. He attended church, donated to neighborhood causes, and shook hands with priests and aldermen. To the community, he was a benefactor. To the underworld, he was a fox in sheep's clothing. At a wedding in Queens, a councilman raised his glass. To Carmine, an honest man among thieves. Colombo smiled thinly, the irony not lost on him. Honesty, my friend, is just another mask, the double game. Colombo thrived on deception. In 1936, he discovered a dispute brewing between Genovese and Lucchese over trucking routes. Rather than pick a side, he fed information to both, each believing Colombo was their ally. When the dust settled, neither won, but both were weakened. And in the confusion, Colombo seized a swath of distribution contracts that neither noticed slipping away. "Let them fight," he murmured to his consigliere, sipping wine. "I'll play the friend today, the enemy tomorrow, the victor always." The knife in the dark, despite his sly nature, Colombo was not above blood. In 1939, a young soldier named Dominic tried to break from his crew, dreaming of starting his own racket. Colombo smiled, clapped the boy on the shoulder, and wished him luck. 2 nights later, Dominic was found in an alley, throat slit. At the funeral, Colombo wept openly, consoling the family, paying for the burial. To outsiders, he was grief-stricken. To messengers, the message was clear. No one left Colombo's fold alive. The council trick, in 1942, the 5 families gathered to settle disputes over Harlem territories. Tension burned between Bonanno and Genovese, their voices sharp, threats hanging in the smoke. Colombo sat silently at first, sipping his wine, watching. Then, at the perfect moment, he leaned forward. "Why fight over Harlem?" he said softly. "Give Genovese the uptown clubs, give Bonanno the gambling dens. And for peace's sake, let me manage the docks between them." Neutral ground. The others, eager to avoid war, agreed. Only later did they realize Colombo had positioned himself as gatekeeper between 2 powerful empires. The smiling snake, by 1945, Colombo's influence stretched further than anyone expected. He had no single kingdom like Gambino's Brooklyn or Genovese's Manhattan. Instead, he held slivers everywhere: warehouses in Brooklyn, speakeasies in the Bronx, trucking contracts in Queens, and political favors in Manhattan. He was the thread stitching the families together, and the knife waiting to cut it apart. To his men, he said often, a storm destroys itself. The survivor is the one who bends with the wind. And Colombo, smiling, bending, weaving through chaos, survived better than anyone. Part 3, Chapter Joe. Tensions. Rising 1950 to 1960, the beginning of the bloody era of betrayals and inter-family conflict. Chapter 9. Tensions rising 1950 to 1960. By the dawn of the 1950s, the five families had matured into empires. Each ruled its borough, each had carved its dominion, and each had tasted wealth that their fathers in Sicily could never have imagined. But wealth breeds ambition, and ambition breeds distrust. New York, once divided with fragile order, became a city simmering with tension. The underworld whispered of broken deals, silent betrayals, and councils that resolved nothing. And in the shadows, soldiers sharpened knives for the wars to come. The cracks appear at first. The cracks were small. A Genovese captain extended his hand into a Harlem gambling racket that Bonanno considered his. A Gambino enforcer collected protection money from a trucking company already under Lucchese's watch. A Colombo soldier skimmed off Brooklyn shipments, claiming it was just business. Each offense was minor, but together they formed a storm. When the bosses met in 1951, the table was heavy with silence. Genovese sipped his wine, eyes calm but calculating. Gambino leaned forward, fists clenched. Bonanno scowled openly. "This is not the agreement we made," Bonanno said, his voice sharp. "My men bleed for Harlem, and now yours steal it from me." Genovese replied softly. "Business grows. Boundaries shift. Adaptor. We die." Carlo Gambino slammed a fist against the table. "Adapt too far, Vito, and you'll find my men waiting on your doorstep." Colombo smirked, as always. "Please, Carlo. Threats are cheap. Profits are better." The meeting ended without blood, but the air in New York was heavy, ripe with war. The silent war the families did not strike openly at first. Instead, they tested each other with shadows. Wiretaps buzzed with secret conversations. Informants whispered names in police precincts. Shipments vanished from docks. Trucks broke down mysteriously, their cargo gone by morning. Lucchese in particular thrived in this era, his web-catching whispers others ignored. One night in 1953, he invited Gambino to a quiet dinner. "Your man on the docks," Lucchese said smoothly. "He's not yours anymore. Genovese bought him." Carlo's jaw tightened. "What? And you tell me this because—" "Because," Lucchese replied with a smile. "Today he works for Vito. Tomorrow, he could work for me." Trust became a luxury no one could afford. The Bronx erupts. The first real blood came in 1954. Bonanno's crew clashed with Gambino-esque soldiers over a numbers racket spilling from Harlem into the Bronx. What began with fists ended with gunfire in the streets. One night, Tommy guns rattled in front of a Bronx bar, leaving 3 Gambino men dead in the gutter. The papers screamed of gang wars, and the police swarmed. At the next council, Gambino's fury was barely restrained. "Joe, your men crossed a line." Bonanno leaned forward, eyes burning. "Your men crossed first. I only finished it. Enough." Genovese snapped, slamming his glass down. The room fell silent. "The more noise we make, the closer the law comes. Keep your vendettas quieter, we'll all hang." But the damage was done. The Bronx was at war. Colombo's game. Carmine Colombo played both sides. He offered Bonanno safe houses for his men while secretly supplying Gambino with information about Joe's movements. When his consigliere questioned the duplicity, Colombo laughed. "Let them bleed. Every bullet they fire puts another $1 in my pocket." By 1956, Colombo had doubled his profits while neither Gambino nor Bonanno noticed. He was no lion, but a vulture, and vultures feasted well on war. The commission in 1957, pressure from law enforcement forced a reckoning. A secret meeting, later known as the commission, brought not just the 5 families but representatives from Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Jersey. The bosses gathered in an upstate estate, cigars glowing in the night. The atmosphere was electric alliances shifting, futures uncertain. Genovese, calm and deliberate, argued for structure. "Without order, we invite ruin. We must govern ourselves as kings, not street thugs." Bonanno scoffed, muttering about ambition disguised as order. Gambino watched quietly, waiting for the right moment to speak. Lucchese measured every word, weaving influence silently. Colombo whispered in corners, promising loyalty to whichever side looked strongest. But beneath the civility, daggers were drawn. Each boss left knowing that peace was only skin deep. Knife's edge by the close of the decade, New York was a powder keg. The families were richer than ever, controlling unions, docks, gambling, construction, and more, but unity was a myth. Every handshake concealed a threat. Every smile hid betrayal. And though the city glowed brighter than ever, its shadows were darker, deeper, filled with whispers of the wars to come. The five families were kings, yes, but kings who sat on thrones of knives. Chapter 11. Blood in the Streets, 1970 to 1980. The 1970s dawned with a sharp edge. The invisible war of the 60s wiretaps, informants, and betrayals gave way to something louder, bloodier. Bullets cracked again in the night. Car bombs rattled the streets. The city, already choked with crime and corruption, became a battlefield where loyalty died and ambition wrote its name in blood. The Colombo shooting. In 1971, Carmine Colombo stood on a stage in Columbus Circle, dressing a rally of his Italian-American Civil Rights League. The sun was bright, the crowd roaring, flags waving. Colombo raised his hands to speak when 3 shots rang out. He collapsed, blood pouring from his chest. Panic tore through the crowd. Men screamed, women fainted. The rally became chaos. Colombo survived, but barely. The bullets left him paralyzed, his mind sharp, but his body broken. From his hospital bed, he whispered orders through intermediaries, but his power waned. His captains schemed, his soldiers drifted. The vulture who once played every side was now a wounded bird, and the streets smelled weakness. The rise of Gambino with Colombo, crippled, and Bonanno exiled, the balance shifted. Carlo Gambino, quiet and patient for decades, now sad as the unchallenged king of New York. His hand was in everything: construction unions, trucking, gambling, narcotics. Judges, politicians, and police captains owed him favors. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, but his word carried more weight than bullets. At a meeting of the commission in 1972, he said simply, "We will have peace because I demand it." And for a time there was peace, but it was a peace bought with fear. Genovese's quiet fury, the Genovese family, though still powerful, simmered with resentment. Vito had dreamed of wearing Gambino's crown, but illness and indictments weakened him. From his sick bed, he raged at the news of Carlo's dominance. "Carlo waits like a spider," he growled to his underboss. "He lets others fight and die, then takes the web for himself, curses patience." But patience, as always, was Gambino's weapon. While Genovese weakened, Gambino grew untouchable. The Bronx burns, meanwhile. The Bronx became a war zone. Bonanno's fractured family split into factions, captains killing captains, soldiers switching sides. Bodies appeared in alleys, warehouses, and on the steps of churches. One night in 1975, a Bonanno lieutenant's car exploded outside his mistress's apartment. The papers called it the Bronx bombing. To the families, it was just business. Lucchese, ever the spider, spread his influence through the chaos, taking control of unions while Bonanno's house collapsed. The death of a king in 1976, Carlo Gambino died quietly in his Long Island home, surrounded not by bullets or betrayal but by family. He left behind not only an empire but a vacuum. The funeral drew thousands: capos, soldiers, even politicians in dark coats. The city held its breath, wondering who would inherit the crown. Paul Castellano, Carlo's cousin, and a businessman more than a killer, took control. Some respected him, many did not. In the shadows, men whispered, "Castellano is no Carlo," and whispers in New York often became bullets. The streets drown in blood. By the late 1970s, New York's underworld was drowning in violence. Colombo's family tore itself apart. Bonanno's remnants clung to scraps. Lucchese grew stronger. Genovese bided time, and Castellano tried to wear Gambino's crown. But the city itself was collapsing, bankrupt, crime-ridden, aflame with drugs and decay. The mob fed on the chaos, but the chaos fed on them too. Every week, another body. Every month, another headline. Mob boss slain. Car bomb rocks Brooklyn. Union chief vanishes. It was the end of the old ways and the beginning of something darker. The shadow of the future. By 1980, the families were no longer kings above the law, they were targets. The FBI had new weapons: RICO laws, surveillance teams, wiretaps planted in restaurants and clubs. Informants multiplied, rats chewing through empires. And in the streets, a new breed of gangster rose, louder, brasher, bloodier, men who did not fear the commission. Men who would soon rewrite the rules in fire and blood. The streets of New York had always belonged to the 5 families. But the streets were changing, and not even kings could stop it. Part 4, Chapter 12. The fall of the bosses, 1980 to 1990. The decade when the old order shattered and the law finally closed in. Part 4. Decline of Empires, Chapter 12. The fall of the bosses, 1980 to 1990. The 1980s arrived like a blade. The neon glow of Manhattan masked a city rotting beneath, crack cocaine flooding the streets, unions bleeding money, politicians on the take. For decades, the five families had thrived in shadows, but the shadows were shrinking. The government was no longer fumbling in the dark. They had names, recordings, witnesses, and within the families themselves, betrayal burned hotter than ever. Castellano, the pretender. When Carlo Gambino died, Paul Castellano inherited the throne. But Castellano was no street boss. He preferred silk shirts to bloodied hands, stock deals to backroom brawls. He spoke of profit margins like a banker, dined on steak in his Staten Island mansion, and kept mistresses in Manhattan apartments. To the old-school soldiers' men who bled in alleys and hustled in clubs, he was a joke. "Big Paul eats steak while we eat bullets," one soldier spat. Resentment festered, and in the smoke-filled bars of Brooklyn, a new name began to rise. John Gotti. The dapper Don Gotti was everything Castellano was not: loud, ruthless, flamboyant. He strutted through Queens in $1,000 suits, laughing in front of cameras, tossing bills to waiters like a king among peasants. The press adored him, calling him the Dapper Don. To the public, he was a folk hero. To the commission, he was a problem. But to the street soldiers, Gotti was salvation. He drank with them, fought with them, lived their life. Loyalty followed him like smoke trails after gunfire. The assassination of Castellano, December 16, 1985. Sparks Steakhouse, Midtown Manhattan. Castellano arrived for dinner, his bodyguards close. He stepped from his car beneath the restaurant's glow, unaware of the men waiting in the shadows. Gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped into Castellano and his driver, bodies collapsing onto the icy pavement. Blood stained the holiday-lit sidewalks. The city gasped. The newspapers roared, and by morning, whispers spread. John Gotti had taken the throne. The commission on trial, but while Gotti basked in his bloody crown, the government struck. Using the RICO Act, prosecutors brought the full weight of the law against the Mafia. For the first time, entire families, not just individuals, were targeted as criminal organizations. Wiretaps caught every word, every meeting, every deal. Hidden bugs in social clubs recorded the bosses condemning themselves. In 1986, the commission trial sent bosses from the Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families to prison for decades. It was a crushing blow. The commission, once the shadow government of New York, was crippled. Gotti's reign, yet Gotti thrived, at least for a time. He walked free from trial after trial, jurors bribed, witnesses silenced. Each acquittal made headlines. Crowds cheered outside courthouses. The Teflon Don, they called him nothing stuck. But inside the Gambino family, cracks widened. Gotti's thirst for fame brought heat on everyone. His reckless violence made allies uneasy. And his own underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, watched carefully, biding time. The fall of the old guard. By the end of the 1980s, the golden age was over. Bonanno's family was shattered, barely surviving. Colombo's was fractured, its boss paralyzed, captains scheming. Lucchese and Genovese reeled from indictments, their power cut in half. Even Gotti, triumphant in the streets, was walking a knife's edge. The streets still whispered the names of the five families, but they were no longer kings above the city. They were prey, hunted by lawmen and betrayed by their own. The empire built in blood and shadows was cracking. The cracks were spreading. Part 4, Chapter 13. Part 4. Decline of Empires, Chapter 13. The Teflon Don's Fall, 1990 to 2000. By the dawn of the 1990s, John Gotti was not just a boss, he was a legend. He had taken Castellano's crown in blood, defied the law through trial after trial, and ruled the Gambino family with ruthless charm. The papers called him the Teflon Don. Crowds cheered when he walked free from courtrooms, reporters jostling for quotes as if he were a movie star. But fame is poison in the underworld. Poison always kills. The reign of Gotti's headquarters was the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy. Night after night, he held court there, laughing, boasting, surrounded by captains and soldiers who adored him. He was loud where Gambino had been quiet, flamboyant where Carlo had been patient. To the public, he was untouchable. To the FBI, he was target number one. Unbeknownst to Gotti, the walls of the Ravenite had ears. Hidden microphones recorded every boast, every command, every whispered order to kill. The Teflon Don was wrapping himself in his own noose. The betrayal of Sammy, the Bulljohn's underboss, Sammy Gravano, had been his most loyal lieutenant. A killer with cold efficiency, Gravano had carried out Gotti's orders without hesitation. But loyalty frays under pressure. When the FBI confronted Gravano with recordings of Gotti blaming him for murders, Sammy snapped. In 1991, he turned informant, the highest-ranking mafioso in history to do so. His testimony was a death sentence for Gotti, the trial of the century. In 1992, Gotti stood trial for murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. The courtroom was a theater, the world watching. Reporters lined the streets. Crowds gathered daily. But this time, no jurors were bribed. No witnesses were silenced. Sammy Gravano sat on the stand, recounting murder after murder, deal after deal, all with Gotti's name at the center. When the guilty verdict was read, the city seemed to exhale. Gotti, once the most feared man in New York, was led away in handcuffs, sentenced to life in prison. The collapse, Gotti's downfall, was more than personal. It was symbolic. For decades, the Mafia had been untouchable, its bosses legends in the shadows. Now the king was caged, and the illusion was broken. Other families reeled. Bonanno's already weakened, splintered further. Colombo's descended into civil war, captains killing each other in the streets. Lucchese and Genovese shrank under constant indictments. The five families still existed, but they no longer ruled. The government had learned their language, cracked their codes, and pierced their veil of silence.
Oh.
The last years of Gotti. From his prison cell, Gotti tried to hold power. He issued commands through visitors, maintained loyalty among some captains, and carried himself as if still a king. But cancer crept in. By the late 1990s, his health failed. In 2002, John Gotti died in prison, his body broken, his empire already crumbling. On the streets, no boss would ever again hold the power he once wielded. The age of giants had ended. The shadow of the past. By the year 2000, the Mafia was a shadow of itself. It still existed in construction, gambling, loan sharking, drugs, but it was no longer the empire that ruled New York. The days of Gambino's patience, Genovese's cunning, Lucchese's webs, Bonanno's fire, and Colombo's schemes were gone. What remained was fractured, smaller, forever hunted. But in the neighborhoods, in whispers on stoops, and in bars, the legends lived on. The five families. The men who once ruled New York from the shadows. Part 5. Epilogue: The Legacy of the Five Families, 2000 present. The new millennium dawned, not with bullets and blood, but with silence. The neon glare of Times Square grew brighter, skyscrapers climbed higher, and New York entered an age of globalization and surveillance. For the five families, once kings of the city, the world had changed beyond recognition. The empires built in smoke-filled rooms and sealed with handshakes now lived under the constant gaze of cameras, wiretaps, and informants. The old code of silence, the sacred omerta, was broken again and again. And yet, against all odds, the five families endured. The survivors, though diminished, they did not die. The Genovese family, still disciplined and secretive, adapted best. Their bosses hid in the shadows, their soldiers worked quietly, their profits drawn not from flash but from patience. They became ghosts, harder to catch, harder to destroy. The Gambinos, scarred by Gotti's fall, rebuilt cautiously. No more cameras, no flamboyant suits. Their leaders stayed invisible, their reach still stretching into unions, construction, and international rackets. The Luccheses survived through cunning, their spider web intact though smaller. The unions remained their heart, a quiet lifeline that kept money flowing while attention stayed elsewhere. The Bonannos, once shattered, limped on through internal wars and betrayals. Their name carried shame after their boss turned informant in the 2000s. But still they clung to life, refusing to fade entirely. The Colombos tore themselves apart with civil wars, captains gunning each other down even into the 1990s. By the 2000s, they were a shadow, fractured but not erased. The new war, the FBI, the DEA, Homeland Security, new enemies rose, armed not with Tommy guns, but with data, surveillance, and global reach. The war was no longer fought in alleys, but in courtrooms, wire rooms, and cyberspace. And yet, for every indictment, another soldier took the oath. For every captain imprisoned, another rose from the neighborhoods. The Mafia had lost its crown, but it had not lost its blood. The myths remain today. The five families no longer rule New York. They are remnants, ghosts of an empire, surviving in fragments. Their power is smaller, their reach curtailed, their bosses cautious. But their legends remain. In Brooklyn bars, old men still whisper of Gambino's patience, Genovese's cunning, Lucchese's quiet webs, Bonanno's fiery pride, and Colombo's deceitful smile. Their names are spoken with awe, fear, and nostalgia. Hollywood immortalized them, books romanticize them, and the city itself remembers them in its bones. For a century, they were kings of the underworld, shaping New York in blood and shadow. And though the crown has long since fallen, the echo remains. The five families, the empire built on silence, loyalty, betrayal, and blood. The end. Thank you for watching the Crime Stories channel. If you found this story as chilling as we did, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Until then, stay curious, stay safe.